Good afternoon. I'm Patrick Lewis, the Director of Collections and Research at the Filson Historical Society. Thank you again for joining us for Kentucky Unsettled, the Erasure of Native Homeland. Today's program is sponsored by Dinsmore Family Wealth Planning. Now it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker, Kelly Hyberger. Kelly Hyberger, she, her, is the Native American Collections Specialist at the Filson Historical Society in Louisville and has previously worked as the Director of Cultural Resources at the Museum of Us and as the Curator of Collections at the Fraser History Museum. Her tenure in the nonprofit sector is focused on decolonial praxis in museum collections, the repatriation of Indigenous cultural heritage items, and methods for centering authentic, diverse narratives of U.S. history in education and interpretation. Kelly holds a master's in history, a master's in teaching, and a bachelor's in political science from the University of Louisville. We are immensely thankful to her for bringing international attention to the Filson's efforts in the areas of decolonial stewardship and repatriation. Please join me in welcoming Kelly Hyberger.
Hello, and thank you all for coming today. Kentucky is and always has been Native land. For thousands of years, Indigenous people called this land home. When Europeans first arrived west of the Appalachian Mountains, Kentucky's large and diverse landscape was vital to the lifeways of the Cherokee, Chickasaw, Delaware, Miami, Shawnee, and others. Ancestors of these modern-day tribal nations had built cities and villages along Kentucky's waterways. Generations of families lived, made memories, and passed away on Kentucky's soil. Large earthwork mounds dotted the landscape right here in what is now Louisville. Over time, and just as with all civilizations, the cultural makeup of these communities shifted and evolved. But regardless of what these communities called themselves, or what historians and archaeologists might call them today, they called Kentucky home. Native people didn't lose their rights to this land through a single bloody conflict. Instead, they were forced north and west through the slow, systematic bureaucracy of settler colonialism. My goal today is to share the story of how land in Kentucky slowly transformed from native homelands into orderly plots of private property. If you live in Louisville, or Kentucky for that matter, this is the story of how the land that you live on, and maybe even own, was colonized. Colonization is the process through which one group of people seize the land and resources of another for their own benefit. In settler colonialism, the goal is not only to seize the land and resources, but to also delegitimize and erase the presence of previous occupants. Settler colonialism in Kentucky not only took physical control of the land, but also propagated the myth that this land was not fully utilized by Indigenous people. Settlers presented an oversimplified narrative of Kentucky as an uninhabited backcountry hunting ground for Native people. In reality, this land played a vital role in producing natural resources that sustained Indigenous lifeways. In fact, one reason that Kentucky's natural resources, particularly wild game like white-tailed deer, were so lucrative to colonizers is that generations of Native occupants practiced intentional land management throughout the Ohio Valley. Controlled burns created and maintained large grasslands where deer and other game could graze. Seasonal mobility and numerous temporary village sites allowed the natural ecosystem to thrive, prevented overhunting, sustained diverse habitats, and supported large numbers of animals. In the Ohio River Valley, the early decades of the 18th century were fraught with volatile intertribal conflict between the Iroquois, who had been displaced from their homelands farther northeast, and the Shawnee. This ongoing conflict around the Ohio River reduced seasonal Indigenous presence in Kentucky. However, by the mid-18th century, Shawnee, Delaware, Mingo, and others from the north were beginning to make their way back into the state, establishing large villages north of the river and seasonally moving further south into Kentucky as part of a complex system of natural resource management. In the southern areas of modern Kentucky, a similar period of political unrest, fueled and intensified by colonial encroachment into native lands, brought Cherokee, Yuchi, and Chickasaw peoples into and out of Kentucky lands. Colonial outsiders were unfamiliar or ignored this multi-generational history of Native occupation in Kentucky and discredited Indigenous lifeways that relied on balance and mobility. For these colonizers, it was easy to erroneously assume that Kentucky was a common area, shared by many and owned by no one. Among the first Westerners to encroach upon native lands in the Midwest were French fur trappers and traders. French maps of the North American continent, like this one, created sometime around 1720, often illustrate Indigenous presence on and use of the land. You can see their presence through drawings of stylized Indigenous hunters and buffalo, and a note labeling Kentucky as an area used by Native people for hunting. If you closely examine the map, you can see how early cartographers in North America relied on Indigenous place names and knowledge of the land when drafting maps. But they also designated which European power controlled practically every inch of the continent. Even though this map acknowledges the presence and diversity of Indigenous occupants, the assertion of European dominion still undermines Native rights to sovereignty over their own lands. Maps like these that outline and define who owned land and establish hard political borders were often inconsistent with Indigenous concepts of nationhood and collective property rights. When we think about land ownership today, we imagine clearly defined plots of property. Prior to European colonization, however, many Native tribes viewed land and its resources as a shared group right, something that shifted regularly based on intertribal relationships, negotiations, and alliances. However, European imperial powers seeking to possess Native lands drafted maps of claimed territory and drew lines to designate the scope of their perceived political authority. After decades of conflict between the British and French empires, the French and Indian War in the mid-18th century resulted in huge territorial gains for Great Britain when France was forced to forfeit all of her claims to territory, almost all of her claims to territory in North America. These lands were not uninhabited, and they were not the French empires to cede. They were the homelands of a multitude of diverse Native nations. But with the exodus of the French, the British crown wasted no time in establishing political authority over an ever-expanding western boundary line. Along this boundary line, Indigenous people were actively seeking to limit colonial expansion, keep settlers off their territory, and protect their right to occupy their ancestral lands. Financially drained from the French and Indian War, King George III of England needed to reduce the crown's financial burden of protecting borderland colonists. So, to harden the line between colonial backcountry and Indian country, King George issued the Proclamation of 1763, which designated lands previously claimed by the French for the exclusive use of Indigenous people, including all of modern-day Kentucky. King George's decision here was not so much about providing a sanctuary space and land rights to Native people. It was a strategic decision to limit expensive armed conflict along his colonial border. And he was very clear. From his perspective, the British government, not Native nations, had sovereign authority over governing these so-called Indian reserves. However, the proclamation line was ultimately unenforceable. Colonial officials interested in enforcing this line, they didn't have the manpower or the money to really patrol these border areas. Many other colonial officials had no interest whatsoever in actually enforcing the lines. With the structure of British government, Kentucky was considered part of Virginia and was managed by the Virginia colonial government. And many land-hungry Virginia elites had their eye on Kentucky's land, how to acquire it, and how to move the Native occupants out. Prior to the Proclamation of 1763, a number of Virginians had already sought to establish claims on land west of the Appalachian Mountains. Soldiers during the French and Indian War were even promised payment in the form of newly acquired territory previously claimed by the French. How to attain this land is often a central topic of correspondence between those on the frontier and those back in the colonies. In September of 1767, George Washington wrote to his land agent, William Crawford, that I can never look upon the proclamation in any other light, but I say this between ourselves, than as a temporary expedient to quiet the minds of Indians. It was known and accepted by these Virginians, Washington included, that these lands were not vacant and they were not empty, but they were the homelands of thousands of Native people. Nevertheless, settlers and land speculators poured over the Proclamation line, eager to claim land and establish farmsteads. White hunting parties began to foray deep into Indian territory. Many hunters and settlers were captured, had their possessions confiscated, and then released with instructions to leave Indian territory and not return. But feeling entitled to take this land and its resources from Native occupants, hunters and settlers did not leave as instructed, and they effectively ignored Indigenous attempts to maintain peacefully their rights to their own land. In response, many Indigenous people met these invaders with hostility and hoped attacking the settlements would push colonizers back out of their land. As the boundary between permanent European colonization continued to spread westward into Kentucky, colonial authorities in Virginia, with personal financial interest in controlling Kentucky's land, pushed the boundary line further and further west as they continued to seek more and more land cessions from Native nations. In an effort to push Native occupants out of what would become Kentucky, William Johnson, a colonial superintendent of Indian affairs, brokered a 1768 treaty with the Iroquois to cede their rights to all land south of the Ohio River. The Iroquois thought that if they relinquished what was really a nominal claim on Kentucky, they could secure rights to their ancestral homelands that were really a lot farther northeast. However, Johnson severely misjudged or just chose to ignore and neglect the complexity of intertribal relations and politics when negotiating with the Iroquois. He left the Shawnee and the Delaware, whose villages and settlements were along this territory, completely out of the discussions. He assumed that these two tribal nations were dependent on the Iroquois and would follow along with any treaties that they signed. This slight absolutely enraged the Shawnee, who had not been consulted and did not consent to this treaty. As a result, Shawnee diplomats traveled throughout Indian country in an effort to build a united front against the encroachment of white European settlers. But British officials worked to isolate and separate tribes politically by negotiating further treaties that effectively prevented the Cherokee from uniting with the Shawnee. While some Shawnee still hoped for peace, militants attacked, and they began killing trespassers into their territories. All the while, Virginia officials issued land warrants and conferred ownership of Kentucky property without the consent or inclusion of the Shawnee. Armed conflict continued to escalate in a back and forth series of retaliatory skirmishes between natives and settlers. Finally, in 1774, this conflict reached a tipping point when settlers murdered 13 Shawnee and Mingo individuals camped near modern-day Steubenville, Ohio. Relatives of the slain launched a series of violent retaliatory raids that ultimately led to full-scale warfare between the Shawnees and Mingos in the colony of Virginia. In reality, Virginians had been looking for an excuse to go to war, and in these retaliatory raids, they found one. Historian Patrick Sparrow asserts that Virginians were the aggressors in what was clearly an offensive and unnecessary war. Lord Dunmore, the colonial governor of Virginia, has been accused of agitating for war with the Shawnee so that he could take more and more of their land. William Preston, a Virginia land surveyor and militia leader, noted that the opportunity we have so long wished for is now before us. John Connolly, a Pennsylvanian and political ally of Lord Dunmore, vigorously promoted Virginia's interest in the greater Ohio Valley and publicly encouraged settlers to attack Indigenous people. In return for his support, Connolly was rewarded by Dunmore with a 2,000-acre land grant in present-day Louisville. Connolly was a British loyalist, and he was later exiled from the United States and lost the title to this land. After a few short months of fighting, the Virginia militia defeated the Shawnee in a battle near the modern-day West Virginia-Ohio border, and Lord Dunmore began peace negotiations with the Shawnee leader Cornstalk. Under a threat of having their villages burned, crops burned, and potentially their lives destroyed, the Shawnee agreed to the Treaty of Camp Charlotte, which ceded their claims to all lands south of the Ohio River to the Virginia colony. Virginians weren't the only colonists interested in claiming possession of Kentucky's land. In 1775, Richard Henderson, a land speculator from North Carolina, along with Daniel Boone, met with Cherokee leaders in an attempt to buy out their claims to Kentucky in order to establish a new colony called Transylvania. Despite petitioning for legal recognition of this new colony, Henderson's efforts ultimately failed. Virginia's colonial government, seeking to make its own fortune off Kentucky's land, delegitimized Henderson's negotiations and established its own legal authority to parse out Kentucky land. Native populations with ties to Kentucky saw their ancestral lands scooped up by colonizers and privatized into personal property. When we think about colonial expansion into Kentucky, romanticized ideas about pioneers and covered wagons often come to mind. However, while poor white settlers seeking homesteads on the frontier did exist, many of the first Europeans to claim large quantities of Kentucky's land were actually wealthy businessmen, and the taking and selling of Kentucky land was a lucrative business. Between 1779 and 1780, Virginia sold warrants for almost 2 million acres of Kentucky land. 21 wealthy Virginians each claimed more than 100,000 acres apiece. George Washington, who never traveled to Kentucky, claimed over 5,000 acres. This survey map from the Clark-Height family papers here at the Filson likely dates to the mid-1770s and shows how just a few individuals claimed practically all of the land that now makes up our city. Known as land speculators, these wealthy individuals often never set foot on the land themselves and had no intention of establishing farms or home here. Their plan was to buy up a large section of property at low prices and over time, divide them into smaller pots that could be sold at huge profits. When writing about the money to be made in land speculation in Kentucky specifically, John May, a prolific land speculator backed by Samuel Beal, wrote to Bill requesting additional financial support. He said, "If I had 100,000 at this time, I could in 6 weeks' time locate them lands on land that would be worth $500,000. Settlers and speculators relied on land surveys and maps like these as a tool for reinforcing their own perceived right to privately own indigenous land. According to historian Colin Calloway, surveyors played a vital role in transforming the so-called wilderness into an ordered landscape. Armed with compasses, chains, and logbooks, surveyors advanced a settler colonial society determined to transform native homelands into a commodity that could be assigned a dollar value and bound to a single legal owner. Settlers in the Ohio Valley regularly report of hostility with Indigenous occupants in this land. In a 1783 letter to his father, surveyor Isaac Height described the difficulty in conducting survey work due to the ever-present nature of Native people defending their homeland. Height went so far to refer to the movements of Native people in Jefferson and Fayette counties as invasions. Surveys were a vital step in the transformation of native land into private property, but they were not the only step in a complicated bureaucratic transformation of the frontier. The government paid soldiers and land, particularly during the French and Indian War and the American Revolution. During the Revolution, the cash-strapped new American government did not have the liquid assets to pay all of the soldiers that listed in the Continental Army. So instead, they paid them in land. Primarily land that the British had previously reserved as Indian Reserve, where settlement had been legally prohibited. The new government was effectively able to create wealth and capital where it hadn't previously existed. A majority of these soldiers that were paid in land weren't actually interested in relocating to the frontier. So many of the same Virginia government officials who concocted the plan to pay soldiers with land then turned around and bought the land warrants off the soldiers for fractions of their true value. Some speculators used their connections in government to secure land, and some made claims based on the fact that they already resided on the land, essentially what we would call squatting today. This letter from the Filson's collection is a 1780 claim for land in Kentucky based on a crop of corn grown on the land in 1776. And I find it sad but unsurprising that such a modest connection to land was needed to justify ownership for a white settler when Native families who had resided on the land for generations had been violently denied their rights to the same property. Nevertheless, when claiming land, individuals had to make a formal request for land from the government and hire surveyors to locate their designated plot and map its location. The survey would be submitted back to the government as part of the process for receiving a grant for formal ownership of the land. Political agents and speculators of the late 18th century viewed occupation of Kentucky's lands as inevitable. If you look closely, you'll see that this land grant for Kentucky property, signed in 1780 by Thomas Jefferson, then governor of Virginia, is based around a survey completed in 1774, before the treaty agreements with the Shawnee had ceded their rights to Kentucky land. Unlike George Washington, Jefferson did not participate in land speculation. As a pamphleteer and political activist during the buildup to the Revolution, Thomas Jefferson defended the rights of small farmers and squatters, the type of individual that we might think of as a pioneer, and wrote that these individuals should have the right to appropriate to himself such lands as he finds vacant. However, just a few years later, as the governor of Virginia, Jefferson played a significant role in drafting state laws that enabled privileged Virginians, land speculators, most of whom did not live in the Kentucky territory, to amass enormous quantities of Kentucky land. Vast fortunes and intergenerational wealth was created as Virginia speculators privatized indigenous lands across Kentucky into personal property. The scramble to claim ownership over Kentucky land quickly escalated into a chaotic frenzy, often with multiple individuals claiming ownership of the same property. Taken from the Bill Booth family papers, this survey map of Louisville and accompanying explanatory notes attempts to reconcile rushed and poor survey work, hasty land transactions between individuals, and competing land claims. Issues of land ownership created during this frenzied period of colonization were still being sorted out by the Louisville Title Company decades later. In the western part of Kentucky, the Chickasaw still retained their land rights to parts of their ancestral territory. But just as waves of settlers and colonizers forced Native people from their lands in the eastern and central parts of the state, so too would the Chickasaw be eventually forced from their western Kentucky lands. Kentucky Congressman Matthew Lyon wrote from Eddyville, Kentucky in 1811 to James Monroe, Secretary of State under President James Madison. Lyon writes, "You know the Indians claim the land in Kentucky lying bounded by the Tennessee, Ohio, Mississippi, and the Tennessee line. We have been 10 years applying to the general government to take the title off of those lands, to take the Indian title off of those lands which we have been thus deprived. It is with difficulty that people can be persuaded to keep off of it. Fear of the Indians by no means restrains them." And here he's talking about the Chickasaw people who were living on their own ancestral territory. Land cessions between the U.S. government and the Chickasaw Nation would see their claims to Kentucky land removed by 1818. This map for the plan of the town of Louisville from 1812 shows the full realization of the settler colonial takeover of Kentucky. The once lush forest and vibrant ecosystem of the Ohio Valley would be tamed into submission and parceled out to individuals in clean little plots. Physical maps like this one, created by settlers, surveyors, and property holders, reinforced their perceived rights to own the land and served as a tool for further erasing Native connection to the land. In these maps, there is complete and total Native erasure. All signs of Indigenous presence have been scrubbed away, and the stamp of colonization has been neatly penciled in on plots of private property. This economic and settler colonialism, documented in part through land warrants, surveys, and maps, fueled an enormous financial incentive to erase the land's native connections. Land speculators and settlers justified their actions by creating an oversimplified myth of Kentucky as an uninhabited backcountry hunting ground for Native people. As a result, the idea that Native people never permanently lived in Kentucky became a common myth. As the city of Louisville rapidly grew and expanded in the early 19th century, physical traces of Native presence were also erased and forgotten. Numerous large earthwork mounds, perhaps similar to this mound located in Georgia, dotted the landscape near the falls of the Ohio. These mounds, likely constructed by Native Americans sometimes between the years 1000 and 1400, were destroyed to build downtown Louisville well before the 20th century. The earth from these mounds was used to fill in natural ponds in the floodplain to create a more even landscape for rapid urban development. Because these mounds were destroyed so long ago, we know very little about them, and what has been uncovered is largely found in settler colonial accounts of the Falls area. Today, as you walk through downtown Louisville, if you visit 4th Street Live or drive down Broadway, there is no signs of these mounds and those who lived here and built them for thousands of years before us. Settler colonialism in Kentucky has successfully erased their presence. In Kentucky, the slowly encroaching settler colonialism, demographic takeover, and urban development incrementally displaced and erased Native peoples as white settlers built new lives on taken lands. When we think about the frontier and westward expansion, we think about imperial powers of the English, French, and Spanish, as well as the newly formed United States. Native nations have been relegated to the sidelines and depicted as ancillary annoyances or violent savages along the frontier. In reality, Native tribes were key players in this power struggle, fighting for generations to protect their homelands and ways of life. The ways in which we remember our history and tell the story of the settlement of Kentucky can either continue to perpetuate an inaccurate narrative about the history of this land, or can acknowledge the deep and significant ties that many Native nations have to Kentucky. I encourage each of you to think deeply about our colonial legacy, the Native peoples displaced from this land, and how we can begin as a state, as a community, and as individuals to reckon with our settler colonial past. I want to end today where many people are recently starting to begin, and that is with the land acknowledgement. The Filson Historical Society resides on the ancestral homelands of the Cherokee, Delaware, Miami, Mingo, Osage, and Shawnee nations. The Chickasaw, Peoria, Quapaw, Yuchi, and other Native nations have also called the land now known as Kentucky home. As a guest on these lands, I extend my respect and gratitude to the many Indigenous peoples, past and present, who have called these lands home. Thank you.
Kelly, if anyone does have questions, please come up to either one of the mics and ask them into the mic so that our online participants can hear. Take us away, Pritch.
Excellent presentation, Kelly. I've gotten the impression that Kentucky, though, about a century before Boonesboro was founded, had become something of a debatable land. I know that the Iroquois drove the Shawnee out of the Ohio River Valley in the late 17th and early 18th century.
Mhm.
Then the Chickasaw and the Cherokee combined to drive the Shawnee out of the Cumberland River Valley in about 1715.
Yeah.
And having said that, it makes me wonder, I mean, given the fact that at that time and maybe into the mid 18th century, the center of the population for the Chickasaw were largely in northern Mississippi and West Tennessee. And then, of course, the center of population for the Cherokee was sort of between Knoxville and Chattanooga in modern day East Tennessee. Wouldn't that make their claim as Kentucky as an ancestral homeland kind of tenuous?
I don't think so at all. No. For more than 12,000 years or more, Native people have lived on this land. We refer to them as Mississippian, Adena, Fort Ancient, Paleo-Indian, and archaeological terms as lots of different things. But essentially, those ancient communities of people are the ancestors of these modern day tribes, full stop. Those people did not go extinct and they did not disappear. Just like any cultural group, over time, there's evolutions and shifts. Groups merge and coalesce and split apart. So even though over that 12,000 year history, the makeup of modern day federally recognized tribes doesn't exactly mirror the image of these earlier groups, that connection, that cultural affiliation still exists. And yes, it's true that a lot of these indigenous groups, the Shawnee, the Chickasaw, the Cherokee, had been pushed off of this land in the 17th century or 18th century, but in large part that's due to intertribal conflict and displacement that was happening along the East Coast as a result of English colonization and expansion. So I don't really think it's fair to say that because our political problems caused political problems and they fled this area 100 years ago, that means that they don't have a right to it now. If you look at the intergenerational patterns and you look at the ways that archaeologists and historians are piecing together movement of these different groups of people around this time, and if you look at the oral traditions of those tribal nations, they were making their way back into this territory. So that political upheaval that had pushed them out in the 17th century, as if that was coming to a rest, they were moving back in and were going to resume the same occupation of this land, most likely that they had for thousands of years.
Okay, just a quick follow-up comment. My understanding that the oral traditions of the Cherokee really don't go back far enough in time to take them out of the Southern Appalachians. So I don't, see where they would have regarded, for want of a better phrase, mound builders as their forebearers in present day Kentucky. But
so the mounds extend all through Kentucky down into the southern parts of the state. Mounds exist from Illinois, Indiana, Ohio, all the way down into Florida and Georgia. So the mound builders that were living in Louisville or living in Kentucky were not an isolated subset, but they were part of a large interconnected tribal network that was vastly complicated and connected people and cultural groups all up and down waterways of the entire southeastern quadrant of what's now the United States.
Okay, thanks, Kelly.
Yeah.
I'll yield the mic.
Please, if anyone else has questions, come up. Also, if you're watching online, jump into the chat. I wanted to go back to one of your last slides with the map of mound sites in Louisville. For those of you who have not been into the carriage house recently, that corresponds with an exhibit that we have that you curated up in there. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about those points that you have on display in correlation with that map.
Yeah, so as settlers, colonists, and pioneers were making their way down the Ohio River, they recorded in their travel accounts and journals large native mound sites that had been kind of largely abandoned at the time that they arrived, but were signs of enormous, complex native societies that lived right here in downtown Louisville that connected into the larger network that ultimately funneled up most likely to Cahokia, if you're familiar with that. So we don't know a whole lot about these mounds because most of them were destroyed very early, but they exist in letters and journals. Reuben Durrett, a founder of the Filson, tried to collect oral history about these mounds. And in his paper, he recorded he's recorded some recollections that they exist. And a couple of local archaeologists did a lot of work several years ago, combing through archival records all over the state, looking for as many accounts as they could of these mound sites that were destroyed. There was even a house in downtown Louisville, or a house in what's now downtown Louisville, built, I think around 1820 on top of a mound. It was a doctor's house, and he chose to build his residence on top of that mound. And that house stood there for several decades until it was also ultimately destroyed, and the mound along with it before the turn of the 20th century. But I worked with the archival work done by the archaeologists and historians before me and our assistant curator of exhibits to plot these points all on one map of downtown Louisville to just give you an understanding of how complex Native life and settlement would have been here on this land at one point. I'll go back to that so you can. Yeah.
Hi, thanks for a great presentation. Appreciate that. A week ago, I was at the Native American Museum in DC. And one of the questions that always fascinates me about these discussions is trying to get our heads around the different concepts of land that we bring with our, pardon the facetiousness, divine right to develop real estate, and the Native conception of land. And I'm started reading a book called Land Too Good for Indians, which is about removal north of the Ohio. And that whole idea that, I'll cut to the quick. It's a prickly question maybe, but I'm wondering the degree to which religious rationalizations played. I know in some areas it did, but I don't know that much about here. The way those rationalizations played out in terms of Europeans feeling a sort of not just privilege, but almost obligation to put this land to productive use. Did that play, have anything to, have you run across those kinds of rationalizations, I guess? And I'm asking that as a person of, who identifies as a person of faith who is sometimes nauseated by what gets done in the name of that. Anyway.
Yeah. Yeah, you definitely run across a multitude of ways that settlers and colonizers attempted to rationalize and justify their actions. And some of those are founded in scientific racism that purports that certain races are physically or intellectually superior to others. Some of those are founded in religious justification, in being sanctioned by God to do certain types of activities. I'm quite cynical when I read this and think the root of most of it is financial incentive. When you look at the ways in which the land was taken, the ways in which it was divided up and who benefited from that, it tends to be an inner circle of wealthy Virginia elites who are in positions of power across businesses, enterprises, and governments that are consistently working to increase their own financial wealth and find ways to justify those actions, either so they can sleep at night or convince people to keep them in power. Yeah. Did you have a question? I know you were standing. No, you can come right here.
I was just wondering if you could go, can you hear me there?
Mhm.
Go back to that map where you showed the plan for Louisville and say exactly, where exactly that is.
This is like downtown Louisville, Main Street Market. This is a laser pointer. Oh, no, that's not a laser pointer. Okay. All right. So this is Main Street right here. This is Market. This, I believe, is, you can see the numbers. I can't quite make them out. But those are like the numbered streets of downtown Louisville. Where would we be? We would be farther on down here. Yeah, we would be farther on down there. And this map is also reproduced and on display in the carriage house, so that if you want to look at it further, you can take a look at it down there. And if you stay tuned, we are working on getting all of my sources and documents and notes up on an online exhibit. So hopefully in the next few weeks, you'll be able to log on to the Filson's website and really zoom in detail on your computer screen and look at the details of some of these.
Thank you very much, Kelly. It was a very, very interesting and insightful kind of presentation. So thank you for that. Your research has kind of opened up, probably in the modern day era, a lot of a can of worms, right? I mean, because it's a lot of uncomfortable truths that many people have to face. The reality that Kentucky was built on stolen land, effectively.
Absolutely.
And so the reality now in terms of the modern era, we're seeing that settler colonialism or colonialism isn't dead. It's actually alive and well, both in the US and globally.
Mhm.
And a lot of the financial kind of incentives and imperatives you've spoken about are very alive and running today, right? Have you, in your research, tried to make a connection between what happened historically and the very forms of colonialism that existed then, how they have transplanted also the modern kind of financial relations we see both in the US, whether it comes to housing, education, and inequalities across different groups and minorities in the US, and also globally as well?
Yeah.
Thank you.
You see the ways in which the federal government is still denying Native land rights today and still interfering with Native sovereignty on their reservations and in their sacred areas. So this is still actively happening, and our federal government is still perpetuating these same types of affronts to Indigenous sovereignty to land pretty much on a daily basis right now. I also think the way that this is taught in the school systems and to children and youth is really important, because one of the reasons that the government is able to assert themselves and violate Indigenous land rights is because most people don't have a working understanding of what Native sovereignty is and what Native land rights are and their connections to that land. And when you don't understand the history, it becomes really easy to discredit the modern actions and implications. So it's really important that we think about the ways that we're educating the next generation for what settler colonialism looks like, and all of these little insidious ways that the native erasure and oppression of marginalized communities and peoples of color across the United States is sort of like continued to perpetuate in these really quiet, sneaky ways that if you didn't know were there, you might never see.
I have a question about the Virginia land speculators. Did any of those individuals have descendants who later settled in those areas? Can we see their names and local landmarks or anything like that?
Oh yeah, absolutely. The Christian family, the Preston family, the Bullitt family. Let's see. You can see some of them like there. I think this is William Preston here on the bottom. Preston Highway, for example, runs through Louisville based on property lines of land claims that were originally assigned to members of the Preston family. As around this time, right before the revolution, a lot of land titles were given to people, political allies based on their loyalty to the British Crown. And then during and after the revolution, those claims were removed when people were exiled or arrested. So tracing the property ownership and how things moved around, particularly in downtown Louisville, becomes really complex. And this is just a very small section of what is now Louisville. So it gets really hard to look and see. But if you think about most of the big names in Kentucky history, one way or another, they're probably ultimately connected into these land schemes.
Hi there. I just want to say thank you for the work you're doing. I think it's very important. It's timely. It's happening, around our country. People are starting to come into awareness about, the roots of this country, what it's actually built on, and, what our possibilities for the future are. And I just want to say that I know it's really overwhelming. It's so overwhelming sometimes. There's so many layers of emotion and so many layers of, if we're white and we're in this country, we definitely, this is our history. We play a role in it and we benefit from it. So I just want to say that, and I want to witness that. And I think, the work is just, there's so much work to do, but there's also so much hope. And I just wanted to mention something, like I've done there's a group called the Healing and Reconciliation Institute out of Berkeley, California, and they do these online community learning journeys. And the first thing you do is learn how to write a land acknowledgement. And, you know, they're like, they're doing really good work. And so I just want to encourage all of us to get involved in things like this, because I think one of the things that happens when you start like looking into this and doing this kind of work is there's so much crap that comes up in your own emotional weight, you know, and it's hard to move past that. But, you know, working with like healing and reconciliation and doing that kind of work opens up space for like real change to happen.
Yeah.
So I'm going on, but I
No,
just want to
absolutely.
acknowledge what's happening here and say that, you know, this is the time, like what's happening is this is the future. So, yeah.
Yeah, as I've done a lot of this work, and I've looked at a lot of these maps, particularly the surveying maps, and this one sort of extends out. If you look down in the carriage house, you can see Indigenous objects and where they were found in Louisville. They're placed over the site, so you can just see that Indigenous presence was everywhere. In each stage of this, with each new map I'm looking at, I almost habitually look for the piece of property that I own here in Louisville. I'm a homeowner. I'm very privileged in that. And it really makes you stop and think about those long and complicated paths that allows me to go to sleep at night comfortably in my bed on native land that was taken and that I benefit from every single day.
I would just like to ask what preceded this interest that you have in this? What made you pursue it?
Yeah, so I primarily here at the Filson work with NAGPRA, which is the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act. So I work to return ancestral human remains, funerary objects, sacred items back to descendant communities. And in doing that work, you start to learn about all of the ways that colonization impacted Indigenous people that just goes beyond simply removing them from their land. But part of the process of returning these items is I have to do a lot of due diligence research to make sure that I'm contacting the appropriate communities. So with items from Kentucky or Tennessee, I want to make sure that I'm bringing every tribal nation that might want to be engaged in a conversation to the table. So I really started looking at the history of land in Kentucky, because when I grew up in school, I was taught the myth that Native American people never permanently lived here. And I think a lot of people carry that with them. But when I'm faced with ancestral human remains that were here in Kentucky, somebody was here. Somebody was living here. Somebody passed away here. These people were interred in loving, careful, thoughtful ways by people who loved them. And I want to make sure that they get back to the right people. And that's sort of what made me start peeling back these layers of who was here and when were they here and what was it like and why are they not here right now. And I will say that there are thousands of Indigenous people that do still live in Kentucky. Even though the federally recognized tribal nations have been forcibly removed and relocated to reservations outside of the state, there are thousands of Native people connected to those communities and other tribal communities that still reside here in Kentucky.
We've got a question from the chat that asks about the next stage after these lands have been surveyed. What are some of the materials, printed or manuscript, that promote the settlement of these lands back east? What sort of things maybe in the Filson collection are people that can access to understand how these lands are being promoted and sold to Americans on the coast?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And it just didn't make the cut for what I thought I had time for today. There was a lot of promotional material because these wealthy businessmen who are buying up these pieces of property needed somebody to come in here and buy the little chunks up. So, so things like the history of Kentucky by John Filson, who we are named after, become some of that promotional material. Travel writings, travel accounts were the soap opera of the 1780s, 90s, and the early 19th century. That's what people wanted to read and ingest for entertainment and for education. And when you had travel accounts coming out of Kentucky from these romanticized, brave pioneers and heroes who are talking about this really wonderful landscape, that there's no native people here. They did acknowledge the mounds, but they said they couldn't possibly have been built by the Native American people who are here now. They had to have been built by white people who came over from Wales many hundreds of years ago. No joke, seriously. They completely disassociated Native people to this land with those promotional materials to entice people over. And what's interesting is the bottom half of this map from Louisville, I'll make sure that this gets scanned up on the internet, lists in multiple columns the original property holder and then the subplots that could be bought. So you can even see where originally, this is in part done to prepare for an auction of some of these lands. So you can start to see the ways in which the settler colonialism process happens.
Well, if no one's got any further questions, I would invite us all to have another hand for Kelly.
Thank you.